So I have the supreme pleasure of getting a veteran, a stalwart, you might say, of the video games industry on this stage. And as a huge fan of point-and-click adventure games in my youth, I'm especially pleased to invite onto the stage the one and only. Yes, it's Charles Cecil. Please come up on stage. How are you, sir?
What a great introduction.
That was good, wasn't it?
It can only go downhill.
It can only go down. Well, I feel like you should start on a high, and then hopefully people remember that, and then when it just descends into chaos later on, it's fine.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, thank you for such a warm introduction.
Yeah, are you excited to be here? I'm excited to hear what you've got to say.
I love these shows, because maybe sort of 10, 15 years ago, they just didn't exist. It was all about trade shows, and it's just great to meet, the people that play our games. And that's one of the themes.
Now.
That's one of the themes of my talk, actually, the ability to talk to people that play our games rather than having to always go through publishers. Not that I'm knocking publishers, but always having to go through publishers, the fact that the retailers, you guys had to go and buy your games at retail. And now there's this direct relationship, which for me is really valuable.
I mean, because obviously, in your history, things have changed hugely. I mean, I presume you kind of made a game and it was all in this little bubble. But now I mean, feedback's great, but not always great.
The original game that I wrote, and you'll forgive me for patronising, but I love doing this, was for the ZX81, and it had 1K of memory. And this has got 64 gig, so it's 64 million times as much memory. So yes, that has changed an awful lot.
A little bit.
But in that 1K, we wrote chess programs and things. One of the reasons that British programmers are so good at writing tight code goes back to those Sinclair days, and indeed the BBC days. And meanwhile, the Americans had 64K of memory.
I mean, that's just over the top.
I know, it's
Americans
ridiculous, isn't it? And that's kind of defined the different styles between American gamers American programmers and UK programmers.
Necessity is the mother of invention,
absolutely,
as they say. Yeah. When you're shoved into a corner, you find an ingenious way of escaping, as I found a lot of time in my free time. So I'm going to hand over to you, sir. If there's a bit of a Q&A, if anyone has any questions at the end, I'll be happy to field those questions. So
okay, well, you need to think about some questions, otherwise there's going to be that really embarrassing wait where I look around hoping that somebody's going to ask something. So just bear that in mind.
Basically, it's mandatory. Mandatory question asking, so you better.
I've also been told that Julia's going to give me dirty looks if I go on for more than about half an hour.
I'll give you dirty looks anyway if you like, because it's entirely up to you.
Fantastic. Well, as I say, thank you for that very generous, Julia. Thank you for that very generous introduction. What I want to talk about is just the adventure games that I've written and how the industry has sort of changed and how we've managed to engage directly with people. I've kind of sort of ruined the first slide already, but this is where I started back in 1981. As I said, it had 1K of memory, and I was lucky enough to be invited to write a text adventure. And the interesting thing about adventure games is that back in the day, back in the 80s and the early 90s, they really were the genre that were used to move technology, to show off technology, to show off storytelling, to show off graphics. The Amiga and then before that the PC often used adventures because they looked so spectacular. And then when we moved to CD and CDs came in, again adventures were used to show off the technology. But I'll come back to that in a little bit later. So the ZX81 was launched by Sir Clive Sinclair in 1981. As I said, it had 1K of memory, although you could stick 16K in there. It shone very, very brightly for a very short time because the Spectrum took over. But it was designed extremely presciently because, of course, as you played on your more advanced computers, you could use it as a doorstop. And back in those days, and in many ways, back in those days, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This was my first game. I know that most of you won't have any idea what Letraset is. It's kind of showing your age. Julian will. But Letraset was the stuff that you could buy. You could buy in stationers, and this was the sort of computery text. So Adventure Bee, I actually designed this absolutely appalling logo. I mean, it's really quite shocking now. And as you can see, I am in a jungle clearing. What do you see? A branch. I can't do that yet. I do now know that there should be an apostrophe between the N and the T. And also that as as I was told, Cecil is not spelt with a Z. But back in those days, there were no such things as spell checkers. And a little bit later, we got a little bit more savvy and we produced better graphics. And instead of calling it Adventure B, it was called Inca Curse. And it was very much inspired by the first Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that's shown there. So, back in the day, this was the guy who invited me to write games, Richard Turner, and he was, as most people were, bedroom programmers, inevitably young men, who would come up with an idea. They would program it. They'd create the graphics. They'd create the music. They'd do absolutely everything. And then the way that we then sold things is at microfairs. And to go back to the point that Julia said, we had the pleasure then of meeting people that actually enjoyed our games. And the reason, actually thinking about that Cecil story, the reason that I now know that Cecil is spelt with an S rather than a Z is because a young father came and told me that he'd managed to convince his wife that he should buy a ZX81. And because it was good for the education of the kids. And then he was playing the game, and the spelling was so awful. So that was a really, really fun period. That's going back to the early 80s. So if we now fast forward to 1990, when I founded Revolution, the games, as you saw, were very simplistic, text-driven, and having worked for a company called US Gold, that again some will know and some won't. I really wanted to get back into development, and really, I was inspired by the success of Sierra and how Sierra games like King's Quest and Leisure Suit Larry had been so special and were kind of losing their way. And I got this sense that actually there was this opportunity. And in many ways, we started at the same time as LucasArts. Many times, LucasArts were actually after the same thing. They were looking to kind of move the genre forward. And I'm very proud of the adventure genre, and I think one of the themes that I'm going to talk about is the fact that it should be driving innovation, and in many ways it isn't at the moment. So our first game was called Lure of the Temptress, released in 1992, and that very much went back to the parser system where you typed in words. So you could click on this guy called Rat Pouch, and a verb would tell Rat Pouch to, and then you'd have all the things that you could like go to or get, and you could pull these sorts of strings of commands together. And at that time, it felt very exciting. I mean, one of the things that I really regret is that we never really took that anywhere. And still in the back of my mind is this, what we call virtual theatre. But it did very well, got great reviews, sold well, went to #1 in the charts. But it was very much part of this sort of idea of driving forward the innovation in story and technology. And that was then followed by a game called Beneath a Steel Sky in 1994, which we wrote with a comic book artist called Dave Gibbons. Dave is best known for being the artist of Watchmen, the comic book Watchmen, which was absolutely a seminal comic book in the 80s. And what was interesting about this was that it was the first time that anybody had come up with a new art style. Dave would draw in pencil. Then we had an artist called Les Pace who would paint it. And we had very skillful sprite artists who would then animate this sort of thing. And the interesting thing is, to go back to the beginning of Revolution, we didn't know what we were doing at all. I mean, you couldn't set up a big company as we were in that way now, but we just recruited people locally. And the guy who was a brilliant animator was working as a clerk in Kalamazoo, just around the corner, and he sent us in some stuff. And the guy who did the painting sent us in some stuff. And you kind of, back in those days, you kind of made it up as you went along. And again, that game did quite well, and it was well received. And I have to say, it was a real pleasure working with Dave. We're still friends from that. But the game that we're best known for is Broken Sword, and I'll talk a little bit about how we responded to changes with technology and everything. Broken Sword, the real big thing about that was that Virgin, our publisher, really wanted us to up the ante, to become much more ambitious. And one of the huge seminal moments was meeting a layout artist who had worked in Ireland for the Don Bluth Studios. And he said, you don't want boxes within boxes. He said, all the screens I see in Adventures are boxes within boxes. So what he was able to do, using his huge experience at layout, is to actually provide a different angle. And so you can see here, there's no sense that that you're looking into this rectangular. And previously, that was very much what we were doing. And again, we kind of innovated because we went looking for, while we wanted to retain the gameplay and control, and I was absolutely very precious about that, it was all about working with people from different mediums. So Owen in particular was a hugely skillful layout artist. I'd happened by chance to play cricket with a fellow called Barrington Phelan a few years earlier, and at this stage he'd become quite a well-known composer. I mean, he was writing music for Inspector Morse and Lewis and television programs and film programs. So it was a real pleasure to be able to bring these experienced people together. We were also able to work with experienced actors as well, and again, try and drive forward the production values, and in doing so, drive forward what the adventure was doing. That was then followed a year later by the sequel to Broken Sword, which I have to admit didn't innovate enormously. We kind of had bigger sprites and things, but we were given very little time. And by this stage, there was a real divergence between what publishers thought that our audience wanted and what we actually wanted. So we found it almost impossible to get the game onto the PlayStation. In the end, Sony relented and decided to publish it. And when the official PlayStation magazine, which gave the game 9 out of 10, did a reader's survey, we were voted the 5th best PlayStation game, ahead of Resident Evil, ahead of all these other extraordinarily successful games. And it was really, really interesting because the publishers were absolutely convinced that a game like this would not succeed on PlayStation, that PlayStation was all about visceral games. So for us, that was kind of at that time, the point at which we were writing 2D adventure games, and around us we were being told, despite the fact that the games were being successful, that was the end. So we took a bit of a break, and while we were doing that, the PlayStation went from strength to strength. And the PlayStation was extraordinary because Sony basically took consoles which had primarily been aimed at kids and started pushing them into universities, into clubs, and it made gaming much, much cooler. Before, it was PC for the old bods, and it was Nintendo for youngsters. Sony did a great, great, great job. But in doing so, if you bear in mind that all the games were being sold in shops at that time, the shops wanted to make as much profit as possible, obviously, so they started stocking more and more PlayStation titles, which pushed PC out. And at that point, people decided that the adventure game was dead. Our response to that was when we wrote Broken Sword 3 a few years later, was to make it very 3D based, so that it was primarily aimed at PlayStation and Xbox, and really PC was a secondary concern. And I mean, the game was successful, but it was sold very much as a console game first and foremost, because at retail they were stocking console games. And that was then followed in 2006 by Broken Sword 4. But from a Revolution perspective, we were finding it really, really hard to, frankly, even to survive, because the pressure on us as independent developers in this retail-based model meant that we were finding it almost impossible to make any profit. And I mention this only because as part of the narrative of how Revolution then developed. Everything changed in 2007 with the release of iPhone. And I think as PC gamers, you probably owe a lot to Apple because they changed the model. They changed the model because, first of all, they opened up a market for digital distribution. The fact that broadband was becoming ubiquitous Steve Jobs, with his team, realized that they could produce this piece of gaming, effectively it was a gaming piece of hardware, that could exclusively download games. And that then opened up the opportunities to Steam and GOG and all the portals that, assuming that you're mainly PC gamers, have then come to exploit. The other thing that worked very well for us is that a generation before, Nintendo had been very successful. While PlayStation 3 and Xbox Xbox 360 had gone head to head with each other, Nintendo had been kind of taken a totally different view, and they'd come out with the Wii and the Nintendo DS. And they'd say, we don't care about the technology, we care about the fun, we care about the gameplay, we care about the UI. And in doing that, they'd attracted a huge audience. That audience flocked over to iPhone in 2007, which meant that suddenly there was this massive market. And it was absolutely brilliant because for the first time, we could then start self-publishing. And it was like it had been in the early 80s. It all felt so fresh and so new. And as well as not having the constraints of having to get your games into retail, effectively you had an infinite storefront. It also meant that instead of publishers deciding what they commissioned, it meant that actually the audience decided what they were going to do, what they wanted. So you had, I remember at one particular moment, Finger Flick Soccer went head-to-head with FIFA and absolutely kicked its ass. One that had been written in a bedroom by some kids, and one that had the might of EA behind it. And it was an amazing moment because it showed that actually the model had been totally broken. We were invited by Apple to re-release the first Broken Sword. Now, bearing in mind that the first one was in 1996, so this is 14 years later. And the game got an average Metacritic score of 91%. And that was extraordinary as well, because one would have thought that 14 years later, the idea of re-releasing a game would be impossible. But actually, it did really well. And we were publishing it ourselves, and we were able to move very fast. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how extraordinary it was that the market had changed. First of all, Apple were thrilled. They gave us enormous support, and they invited us to be part of something called the 12 Days of Christmas, which is very much an iOS, and I know that you're PC, but this is kind of relevant. It was where at Christmas you give away the app. You set the price to 0 for a day. And I was kind of a little bit worried about doing that. This was the number of downloads. That number is 2.5 million. So we're a small developer in the north of England, and we have 2.5 million downloads in one day. It was absolutely, I mean, we get some data back. It blew our servers. Broken Sword went into the top 10 most tweeted keywords in the world. It kind of just showed how extraordinary everything was, which is why I urge you to support independent developers, because actually the landscape is extraordinary. Interestingly, and I'm sorry that I haven't got figures in, I've lost the original. This was the day that it went free, so we got no revenues. But look, even though we put it up to full price, sales went up by a factor of 6. So the fact that we'd given it away for a day meant absolutely no difference at all. It was all about the PR that we got, the fact that people got to find out about the game. This was Broken Sword 2, which we'd just launched, and those sales jumped right back up again. So it was and is an extraordinary time, because all the rules that have been written by the publishers about marketing, about economics, in this digital area get ripped up and thrown out of the window. And on the basis of that, we decided that actually we could start a new Broken Sword game, Broken Sword 5. And I'd like to talk to you briefly about the Kickstarter that we went through and the engagement with our community, because for me it was just the most amazing thing. Now I'm going to show you a movie in a minute, and there's a lot of noise, so you don't know if you'll be able to hear it or not. I'm getting the thumbs up, so hopefully that's right. But the message that I wanted to convey, given that this is 2012 and the first Broken Sword had come out in 1996, was that, oh gosh, I thought Julia was telling me off then. I was going to be terrified. You see the power that she has. the message that I wanted to get across to people was, one, George and Nico are back. Two, a lot of people had felt that 2D was better than 3D, so we were saying we're going back to 2D. That it's point and click, but it's in HD, and we've got a faster animation rate. So on one hand, it's taking the traditional point and click and a lot of those games, but it's brought up to date. So this is the movie that we put together. I'll show you the first couple of minutes. So bear in mind that those were the messages that we were trying to convey.
Paris in the spring, the scent of blossom on the soft breeze. Love was in the air. Life was good. Nico and I had met again by chance at an art show. The evening stretched ahead. I was about to suggest dinner when fate intervened in the shape of a pizza guy with a gun. He took a life. And he stole a painting that was worth little and meant even less. Or so I thought.
Why did he have to kill him, Georges? What's going on?
I don't know, but we're gonna find out. Once again, Paris had shown me her dark side. Nico and I were about to be drawn into a new and terrifying adventure together. A journey into a conspiracy as old as the written word, where ancient heresies would cause innocent blood to spill once more. I had a bad feeling, and I really hate the sight of blood.
And cut. Perfect. Terrific work, guys. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap.
So, what's next, Charles?
That's it, I'm afraid, unless we get the funding.
That's it? Well, we had some fantastic gameplay lined up.
And we'll never bring the murderer to justice.
And I'll miss out on that cable car gig. That is a stunt I was born to do.
What about the Russian henchman that almost killed me?
Mysterious long-lost temple we're going to discover?
The exotic locations?
The ingenious...
I think we can probably kill this, actually. Yeah. Anyway, you won't be surprised to hear that a number of people... I mean, the film did go down very well, but a number of people did point out that I probably shouldn't give up the day job to take up acting. In my defense, I mean, it was obviously green screen, and I was talking to a wall. But the most amazing thing happened. It pulled together a community we didn't know that we had. Ultimately, we had 15,000 people who backed the project, and the sense of camaraderie, the enthusiasm was just unbelievably exciting. It was a month of chaos. By extremely good fortune, it wasn't planned at all. The movie was meant to be launching in June, but it slipped to July and then August. And Gamescom, I mean, a number of you may know Gamescom, massive show in Germany. Not far off 500,000 people go over 3 or 4 days. And the press. So I was able to, because we slipped beyond that date, I was able to talk to the press under embargo. And so when we did launch it later in August, there was a sort of tsunami of press. And we were very lucky. We were after $400,000, and we got a third of it in our first day, which was just great because it takes the pressure off. I feel really sorry for people who do Kickstarters. They put everything into it, and this thing sort of dribbles up. I mean, basically, what happens is by getting a third in the first day, it means that you're pretty safe that you're going to get to, and I'm sorry that that's there. I don't know how to take that out. And this is a fairly inevitable S-bend, as in it starts off, then it gets a bit slow in the middle, and then it goes back up again at the end. And if anybody wants to ask about that, then I'd be delighted to talk a little bit more about that. But, I mean, to sum up, we offered lots of stretch goals. We offered lots of goodies. This was interesting. Midway through, in the first Broken Sword game, there is a goat puzzle, which I see some nods at the back there. Thank you. I knew that I'd arrived when a few years ago I was in a cab, and the guy, London cab, and the guy said, "What do you do?" And you know the way, I write video games, I said. I went, "Oh, all right. Any that I'd have heard of?" And I went, no. He said, "Go on, try me. I said, "Okay, broken." Am I allowed to swear on this, by the way, or not? So I mean, this is just a quote. So I said, "Broken sword." And we were at a traffic light. He turned around and he said, "Are you the bastard that wrote that goat puzzle?" And I thought, that's it. That's great. So bless him. I knew I'd arrived. And what was really fun is our wonderful community came up with this thing called the Order of the Goat. Now it wouldn't have worked if we'd done it, but it was something that kind of somebody came up with this idea, and it just worked so well. And we're really thrilled. And so we put it onto T-shirts, and we put it onto key rings and everything. These are some of the stretch goals. Very naive to put Beneath the Steel Sky 2. That was the funny thing is you kind of do these things, and you've got a month where all hell is broken loose, and somebody says, "Let's do this." You go, "That's a good idea," and you kind of live with it. And that was foolish, because people who are fans of Beneath the Steel Sky and not Broken Sword felt that somehow we were prostituting one for the other. The other mistake that I made, which I think is kind of interesting, is that we'd promised that the game would be DRM free, and utterly accept that there's very good reasons why a lot of people would want DRM free, as opposed to be tied to some Steam, some portal like Steam. And during the production, towards the end, all hell is going on, and the company publishing the retail version, Koch, who were great, basically were doing our Kickstarter, and they said, "Look, we've got to have the master now. We need to have it now, otherwise it's going to be late. Should we use the one tied to Steam?" And I knew that it would come back to haunt me, but it kind of got rid of a problem. And so for a bit, I forgot about it. When we shipped them out, most people are very happy with it, but some people came back and they were so upset that we'd promised a DRM-free version, and it was tied to Steam. And that's very interesting, because there was some quite abusive messages. And it was like, we sit down, and one of the things that I feel in dealing with a community, a reasonably sizable community, is you've really got to be clear in what you're going to say. Don't waver. So I left it for a day, and I tweeted the next day, "Misjudge the sense of passion about this. We will, of course, be giving DRM-free discs to anybody who wants one." And the interesting thing about that was it totally turned everything, because people went, "Wow, they're listening to us." And that's certainly one of the things that I've found throughout, for the last couple of years, having had the pleasure and the privilege of being able to communicate with so many people, is one, as long as you tell the truth, and as open as you can be, clearly you can't say everything, then actually, and as long as you're fair, then actually people are pretty fair back with you. The game raised $771,000 on Kickstarter. Now, again, you learn all of these things. In Germany, a lot of people don't have credit cards. In the UK and in America, everybody has a credit card. In Germany, an awful lot of people don't. So we got a lot of people from Germany saying, "Guys, we want to contribute. So one of the things that we did was opened up PayPal, which doesn't require a credit card, and our total went up to $850,000. We launched the game. I remember when PC boxes were full of really cool things. We were talking about this earlier, when Microprose would give you a simulation and you'd have a book that thick about an Apache Strike helicopter. When Ultima would sell, you'd have Ultima 7 and you'd get maps and stones and coins and everything. And I was really keen to kind of go back to that. So we were able to put out a package which had comic books, which had been written by Dave Gibbons, bless him, soundtracks, an art book, posters and things, and that was really fun. And it's really interesting that actually in this day and age, still there's a demand for retail, which was absolutely fantastic. To talk briefly about mobile, I know this is a PC audience, but the great thing about PC is that people like yourselves kind of expect to pay things. On mobile, back in 2013, and there are no, I can't find any more recent figures. I know this is 3 years out of date. 90% of the money that actually comes into iTunes from the App Store is free to play. 6% is 99 cents, and so it goes up. We're selling Broken Sword 5 for $10. So we are a tiny subset of that little dark green stripe at the top, which is fantastic because actually it does very well for us. And the market is so big and the audience is so diverse that actually for us, having a little subset of that works extremely well. Thanks to the support that we got from Apple, the game went to #1 throughout most of the European territories and got to about number 10, 11 in the US. So we're really pleased. And that then gave us the opportunity to produce a PlayStation 4 and an Xbox One version last year. And that then brings us to the fact that one of the reasons I'm speaking now is that Revolution is 25 years old, and we are about to launch a 25th anniversary box set, which again excites me because it's full of goodies. It's got a Broken Sword USB stick. It's got an audio soundtrack for all of our games. It's got, sorry, this is sounding like an advert. It's not meant to be. I am genuinely excited. I saw it for the first time today and opened it, and it was just brilliant. It was really, really fun. Posters and things. So if you have any interest in our games, then have a look at this. There's, vast amounts of things. So what I'd like to do to kind of finish in my half hour, good, isn't it? Is just to talk a little bit about adventures. I should have asked at the beginning whether many of you are adventure fans. So fantastic, great. And there's a sort of schism going on amongst adventure developers at the moment. Those that are looking back. So you have Ron Gilbert's Thimbleweed Park, for example, which unashamedly is looking back and saying, we loved adventures as they used to be. And then on the other side, you've got people looking forward. You've got some terrific games out there. And if you haven't played Her Story or Life is Strange, look at those because they're looking forward. They're saying, actually, we're part of this magnificent genre that moves forward in terms of technology, in terms of graphics, in terms of storytelling. And I very much hope that Revolution will be seen to be part of the looking forward rather than looking back element of developers. Back in 1981, when I wrote my first games, I had the pleasure of speaking directly to the people who played our games. They told us what they liked, they told us what I didn't like. Then for 30 years, we went through this sort of stasis where we didn't actually know what people wanted. One of the real joys about being able to publish our own games is the fact that people come and tell us. They tell us the stories about when they played Broken Sword. I had one particular young man, or not that young, who told me that when we did the Kickstarter that he started, I'm sure nobody will read this, but I felt compelled to write. We're developers, of course we read everything that comes in. If it's significant, our community manager will send it around to the whole company. And he talked about going into a game shop when he was 10, 11 with his grandmother who bought him Broken Sword. And every day for a month he ran home and he played it with her. And the relationship that he remembered, this warm relationship, was based on playing this video game with her. And I felt very proud of that and I feel very proud for the genre as a whole and for video games because it offers a unique opportunity to play with other people, not necessarily in a combat way, but in a cooperative way, in a way that film or television is quite different. I would argue that it's a great time for gamers because you've got these fantastic $100 million games at one end, the GTAs, the extraordinary Batman, Arkham Knight. If you haven't played it, it is brilliant. Metal Gear Solid, just fantastic games that are really expensive. And then at the other end, because there is no limitation at retail as there used to be, you have these really fascinating indie games, which of course you can see all over this weekender. And that makes it great, I think, for you And the fact that you're excited by indie games, you're excited by this full range, gives us as developers the great opportunity to be innovative in a way that we haven't before, because ultimately you guys always reward us if we innovate in terms of technology and storytelling and graphics. So on that, I'm going to end, and Julia's kind of looking like I haven't done too badly in terms of my half an hour.
You're right. We'll let.
And now is the point at which either she asks me a question or somebody from the audience does.
Mine are only maths-based questions, so I don't think they want any answer to that. Does anyone have a question? Yes, good. Okay, one up.
Has the Telltale Games, you know,
Yeah.
is it a curse or a blessing?
I think Telltale games are great. I think they're great. I mean, they're not... The thing about the adventure is that, I mean, they're clearly not mainstream adventures. They're much more like interactive narratives, right? I mean, they're great. There's absolutely no criticism. And then you look at a game like Heavy Rain, which is fantastic, which is very much looking forward. So I think it's great for the genre. It's kind of not what we would want to write, because we want, I want to write games where the stories and the puzzles are interwoven slightly more than The Wolf Among Us or The Walking Dead. But I absolutely admire them, and I think it's fantastic, because if somebody buys The Walking Dead, then they're much more likely to buy Broken Sword than if they play a different genre. So the interesting thing is that actually adventure developers generally get on really, really well. We did a cross-promotion with Daedalic. I mean, everybody wins. Daedalic, I don't know if you know the German developer, go and buy their games, they're fantastic. And the reason that we can be friends, apart from the fact that we get on with each other, is that actually nobody's going to buy Deponia and not buy Broken Sword, or vice versa. If they buy Deponia, or if they buy The Walking Dead, or if they buy The Wolf Among Us, then they're more likely to enjoy the genre and then play a wider range. So absolutely a blessing. No, I've got nothing negative to say at all.
Hello.
Hello.
So, what are your creative influences? So, in the Broken Sword games, I got a theme that there was a sort of a big travel element and sort of a lot of history that's involved. Where do you go to find the next story that you're going to write?
In Broken Sword, or just more generally?
Just in general.
Well, if I can tell you, Broken Sword was, there's a friend of mine, Sean Brennan, who used to be the deputy head at Virgin. And when we finished Beneath the Steel Sky, so I'm sounding like a politician, I'm answering a different question, but I am aware of the question, I will come back to it. And we were talking about the next game, and I'd pitched him an Egyptian game. And he looked at it, and he didn't even bother opening it. He said, Egyptian games don't sell, which was kind of interesting and probably true. And he just read Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, and we started talking about the Knights Templar. And that kind of, and then I did a bit of research. And what I love in games, or in the Broken Sword game, is trying to make it as authentic as possible, because the audience very quickly come to believe it more than they would do a piece of just fiction. So when people go to Paris, they will, we have loads of people saying, I'm going to Paris, where should I go? And we can send them to actual locations from which you will recognize Broken Sword scenes. And that meant an awful lot. Now, I guess in many ways we were lucky. I was lucky to stumble across the whole Templar thing. Has anybody read the Da Vinci Code? Right, the Da Vinci Code was written way after Broken Sword. So any similarity, if there is a similarity, or if there's any plagiarism, and I would never ever say that Dan Brown has plagiarized anybody, but if there is any plagiarism, it certainly isn't from us. But it kind of opened up this very rich vein of historical backgrounds. Now, that's been kind of ruined by a lot of really, really bad books and films about the Knights Templar, about the Cathars and everything. Partly polluted by a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which talked about the Prior of Sion, which is utter nonsense. And the problem is that if you do put the Prior of Sion in, then immediately any credibility kind of diminishes. I mean, Dan Brown got away with it in the Da Vinci Code, but now it feels cliched and doesn't work. But as far as new games are concerned, ultimately what what for Broken Sword, certainly it's looking for really interesting historical background, and there is. It's just wonderful going. My family, it drives them scatty because whenever we go off, my wife kind of knows that we're going somewhere because it's got a future Broken Sword connection with it. But what we did do, which was brilliant, was we went off to Istanbul and flew off to a place called Urfa. This was for Broken Sword 5. And Urfa was just on the border between Syria and Turkey. And clouds of dust from the explosion. I mean, it's obviously an awful, awful, awful war, but it was very kind of exciting in a sort of visceral way to be so close to it. We were slightly cowardly in that the friend of mine worked for Turk Telecom, and when we arrived in this tiny little airport, we were met by some executives from Turk Telecom from that particular city, so they could take us around. But the ability to go and explore and look for connections is really exciting. That's for Broken Sword. Beyond that...
He totally agreed with you.
Beyond that, the structure of a story really is about motivating the character, motivating the protagonist, and writing a great story. So I don't know if you played Beneath the Steel Sky at all, but Beneath the Steel Sky sort of came together when our protagonist, Foster, went into this strange world. I mean, clearly Blade Runner had been out. A lot of people were inspired by Blade Runner, but if it was like Blade Runner, then it would be cliched because it would be like everything else. So we kind of put a slapstick on top of it and came up with something that felt fresh and new. And I really haven't answered your question at all, have I? I'm really sorry.
It was, what is your favourite colour?
Purple. Thank you.
Why don't we give a big round of applause? I think we should probably wrap it up now. Give your voice a little bit of a rest. Let's have a big round of applause here to Charles Cecil. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us.
No, that was a real pleasure. And I've actually got some comics. If anybody wants a comic, then I'd be delighted to.
You just said
give it
the
to
magic party word, which is swag.
And if you want me to sign them, I'd be delighted to sign them as well. So, but thank you very much
Double
for coming
bonus.
on this sunny Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us on the NVIDIA stage, and I hope you have the red. Well, there's only a little bit left now. If you've got anything to play, you better get on it.